All right, so today we're diving into a part of World War II that you probably haven't heard much about, what it was actually like
Right.
to be a Japanese occupier
Yeah.
in Southeast Asia between 1942 and 1945. And our guide for this deep dive is a really insightful book called Japan's Colonial Moment in Southeast Asia, 1942-1945,
Yes.
The Occupier's Experience, by Nakano Satoshi. And forget that simple good guys versus bad guys narrative.
Right.
Because this deep dive is all about nuance.
Absolutely. It's so important to get beyond, that black and white thinking. And, this book uses diaries, military documents, all kinds of stuff to share how complicated and even contradictory this period was for the Japanese themselves.
And that's what immediately grabbed me. The Japanese military wasn't exactly on the same page about why they were pushing into Southeast Asia, what they called the Southern Advance. Sure, they needed resources. Everyone knows that. But there was this whole other layer to it.
Right. You have that classic war for resources argument that they desperately needed oil and rubber and all that. But alongside this very pragmatic, almost cold-hearted view, you had this holy war rhetoric.
Oh, wow.
They were on this mission to liberate Asian nations from Western colonialism.
Okay.
To create this utopian Asia for Asians sphere.
Okay, so how did those two ideas actually play out? Did they just kind of switch back and forth depending on the day?
Well, the book gives us some fantastic glimpses into this internal struggle. You have figures like Colonel Ishii Akiho, who was really involved in the planning stages, who was all about self-existence and self-defense.
Interesting.
To him, resources equaled survival. He even said conquering the Philippines would make Japan invincible in a long war.
So a real pragmatist.
Very much so.
Focused on the tangible, almost like liberation was just a
Yeah.
convenient side effect.
Exactly. But then you have someone like Colonel Watanabe Wataru, who absolutely eviscerated. The military's guidelines for occupation, called them short-sighted, basically accused the army of acting like a band of thieves.
Interesting.
Focused only on loot. He genuinely believed in a more just and equitable approach. Even criticized the treatment of local Chinese populations.
Wow, talk about a reality check from within the ranks.
Yeah.
So you've got these two camps, the resource-hungry pragmatists and the almost idealistic liberators. It makes you wonder if even they knew what they were really doing.
And that tension, that internal struggle, is key to understanding everything that follows. Because winning those early battles was one thing.
Yeah.
But then came the hard part. Governing.
Yeah.
These vast and diverse territories.
And I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing from there?
Not even close. They had this illusion of control. This idea that military victories would naturally lead to a stable occupation. But the reality on the ground was far more chaotic.
Give us a sense of what went wrong. What were some of those unexpected challenges?
Well, for starters, infrastructure. They managed to capture the Batavsi Petroleum Masapi refinery in Palembang intact, a huge win. But then American engineers at the NKPM refinery completely sabotaged it before fleeing. A major blow.
Ouch. So one step forward, two steps back.
Pretty much. And then there's the economic side. The book shares these fascinating diary entries from Sakakibara Masaharu, a Southern Army officer. And you can practically feel his anxieties about trade disruptions. Shipping was a nightmare.
Wow.
Key commodities were in short supply. He even mentions resorting to smuggling
to
fill the gaps.
It's like the whole system was held together by duct tape and hope.
Exactly. And let's not forget the human element.
Yeah.
The Japanese really struggled to manage the diverse populations under their control.
Right.
Take the Chinese community, the Huaqiao and Malaya.
Okay.
Their policies were all over the place.
Yeah.
Trying to force assimilation one minute, resorting to brutal suppression the next.
Wow.
It created this constant tension and fueled resentment towards the occupiers.
So even though they had this initial military success, cracks were already starting to show.
Absolutely. Their internal divisions, the logistical nightmares, the social complexities, it was a recipe for instability.
Okay, before we go any further, I want to hear from you, our listener.
Yes.
We've just scratched the surface here, but what's standing out to you so far? Are you surprised by any of this?
Think about those competing motivations we discussed.
Yeah.
That push and pull between resources and liberation. How do you think this internal conflict within the Japanese military shaped their actions?
All right, so we've established that Japan's whole southern advance into Southeast Asia was driven by this messy mix of pragmatic resource grabbing and idealistic Asia for Asians rhetoric. But now we're getting to what I think is the most mind-boggling part, the whole concept of independence under Japanese rule. How do you square that circle?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The book really unpacks this idea of conditional independence,
Mm.
essentially. Japan was willing to grant a certain degree of autonomy to
Okay.
these occupied nations as long as it didn't interfere with their own strategic objectives.
So basically, you can be independent, but only on our terms. That seems like it would breed some serious resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And the book highlights how this played out in different ways across the region.
Okay.
Let's take Burma, for example. Initially, there was genuine support within the Japanese army for a truly independent Burma. They even backed a young, charismatic leader, Aung San.
But I'm guessing that didn't last long.
Not exactly. As soon as the realities of resource extraction and maintaining order set in,
Right.
the Southern Army tightened its grip. They needed Burma's resources and manpower for the war effort, and any true independence movement would threaten that.
It's almost like they were trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Mm.
Promote this idea of liberation while simultaneously
Right.
pulling all the strings.
Exactly. And it created this constant tension within the Japanese leadership itself.
Really?
The book even mentions Lieutenant Colonel Machida Keiji, a public relations officer who genuinely believed in fostering national consciousness among the occupied people. He thought raising political consciousness would benefit Japan in the long run.
But I bet the higher-ups weren't too thrilled about that idea.
You guessed it. Imperial General Headquarters, or IGHQ, quickly clamped down,
Oh, wow.
issued strict orders prohibiting any talk of independence that wasn't carefully controlled and aligned with their interests.
It seems like the Japanese government had absolutely no idea what they were doing.
Well, it was a complex situation with no easy answers.
Yeah.
And then you have the case of the Philippines, which is a whole other layer of complicated. President Jose Laurel, the leader of the Japanese-sponsored government,
Yeah.
was in this incredibly difficult position.
I can only imagine. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. On one hand, he was trying to secure the best possible outcome for the Filipino people by cooperating with Japan.
Yeah.
He believed independence under Japan was the only way to avoid further suffering. But on the other hand, he was walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to preserve some semblance of autonomy
Right.
and avoid being seen as a puppet.
Did he manage to pull it off?
It's debatable. Ultimately, he ended up reluctantly declaring war
Wow.
on the U.S. and Britain in 1944 under pressure from Japan.
Oh, wow.
It was a move that was deeply unpopular among many Filipinos and likely solidified their view of him as a collaborator.
This whole independence thing seems like a giant bait and switch. Promise freedom, then tighten the leash when things get tough. Do you think any of these occupied nations truly believed in Japan's Asia for Asians rhetoric?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Were these independence movements genuine expressions of national aspiration, or simply opportunistic responses to a shifting power dynamic? It's something historians continue to debate, and honestly, it probably varied from place to place and even person to person.
That makes sense. You can't just lump everyone into one category. But I can't help but think back to that internal conflict within the Japanese military, the pragmatists versus the idealists.
Yeah.
I wonder how that played out when it came to actually dealing with these independence movements on the ground.
That's a great point. And it makes you wonder if even the Japanese themselves truly believe in what they were selling. Because as the war dragged on
Right.
and the tide started to turn against them, that whole liberation facade began to crumble pretty quickly.
So what happened when the going got tough? Did the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere start to look a little less prosperous?
That's a great place to pick up when we come back. We'll look at how those cracks we talked about earlier turned into gaping chasms as Japan's fortunes changed.
Oh.
And trust me, it wasn't pretty.
Okay, so the wheels are starting to come off Japan's grand plan for Southeast Asia. The war's not going their way. That conditional independence is wearing thin. And those internal divisions we talked about are probably reaching boiling point. What happens next?
Well, as you can imagine, things get pretty messy. Remember those diary entries from Sakakibara Masaharu,
Yeah.
the Southern Army officer?
Right.
They paint a stark picture of the unraveling occupation. Shortages become chronic.
Oh, wow.
Prices skyrocket. There's this constant anxiety about inflation
Yeah.
spiraling out of control. He even talks about having to ration rice and resorting to eating sago porridge. Not exactly a morale booster.
Yeah, I bet that co-prosperity sphere was starting to feel a little less prosperous for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And as the situation deteriorated, the Japanese military's behavior became increasingly brutal and desperate. Discipline breaks down.
Oh, wow.
Atrocities become more common, and that whole liberator image completely evaporates.
Like the mask slips and the true face of occupation is revealed.
Exactly. And this, of course, fuels a backlash. Resistance movements, which have been simmering beneath the surface, start to erupt across the region.
Yeah.
The Philippines, in particular, becomes a hotbed of guerrilla activity.
Right.
They had a taste of real independence before the war.
Right.
And they weren't about to let Japan take that away without a fight.
So it's like their own propaganda backfired. By promoting this idea of Asia for Asians, they inadvertently awakened this powerful sense of nationalism that ultimately turned against them.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And remember, this is happening alongside a very effective U.S. counter-propaganda campaign,
Right.
highlighting Japanese atrocities and exposing the hypocrisy of their liberation rhetoric.
It's like a 1-2 punch. The reality on the ground is getting worse by the day. And then you have this external voice hammering home the message that Japan's promises are empty.
Exactly. The book even quotes a Japanese official, Kuwano Fukuji,
Okay.
who was deeply involved in the occupation of Burma. He writes about feeling increasingly disillusioned
Right.
as he witnessed the gap between Japan's rhetoric and the reality of its actions.
It's one thing to believe in the propaganda yourself, but when you see it crumbling all around you,
Yeah.
that has to shake your faith to the core.
Absolutely. And you see this sense of disillusionment reflected in many personal accounts. From Japanese occupiers who returned home after the war.
Yeah.
They went in with these grand visions of liberating Asia.
Yeah.
What they experienced was often brutality, exploitation,
Wow.
and ultimately defeat.
That's got to be a tough pill to swallow. Realizing the war you fought was based on a lie.
Definitely. It makes you wonder about the psychological toll this took on those individuals and on Japanese society as a whole.
So Japan is defeated, the occupation ends, and Southeast Asia is left to pick up the pieces. But as we've seen, it's not a clean break.
Right.
The experience of Japanese occupation left a deep and lasting impact on the
Yeah.
region, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt. And it's not just about the physical and economic scars. The Japanese occupation, however unintentionally, played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of Southeast Asia in the post-war era.
How so?
Well, for one, it further fueled those nationalist movements we talked about. The experience of occupation, with all its hypocrisy and brutality, only strengthened the desire for self-determination. People had seen firsthand that neither Western colonialism nor Japanese imperialism had their best interests at heart.
So, in a strange way, Japan's attempt to create an Asia for Asians actually helps to bring about the end of colonialism in the region.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
By trying to exploit those nationalist sentiments, they actually ended up empowering them. It's a classic example of blowback.
Fascinating. Are there any specific examples of how this played out?
Absolutely. The book talks about the role of Japanese-trained military units in the post-war period.
Okay.
Take the Peattie in Indonesia, for example. This was a paramilitary force created by the Japanese to help maintain order, but those same soldiers later played a key role in Indonesia's struggle for independence from the Dutch.
It's amazing how these things can come full circle.
Isn't it? And this pattern is repeated across the region. You see former collaborators, people who initially worked with the Japanese, turning against them and becoming leaders in their own country's independence movements. The occupation, in a sense, became a crucible for a new generation of nationalist leaders.
Okay, I want to bring this back to our listener for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground here. The complex motivations behind Japan's occupation, the illusion of independence, the brutal realities of war,
Right.
and the lasting legacies.
It's been quite a journey. And what I find so fascinating is that even in defeat, the Japanese occupation had this unintended consequence of empowering the very forces that would ultimately reshape Southeast Asia.
Exactly. So here's a final thought-provoking question for you, our listener, to ponder. We've talked about the complexities of occupation, the illusion of independence, the rise of nationalism. But what about the concept of reconciliation? How do nations and individuals move forward after experiencing such profound trauma and division? Is it even possible to truly heal those wounds?
That's a question with no easy answers, but it's one worth grappling with as we continue to study and learn from history.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's a chapter of history that's often overlooked, but as we've seen, it's full of surprising twists, complex characters, and thought-provoking lessons that resonate even today.